When I was a kid, at least, or at least years before I began writing as not just a hobby, but as my personal kind of goal when it came to my future dream of being a writer. I actually like to draw a lot, and most of the people around me commented on how good my drawings were, and that's what made me believe that I could become, like, say, an animator or a cartoonist of some kind, or just basically an artist in general. But over time, I decided to lean more towards writing. But I have been getting back to drawing and sketching, at least like recently speaking, as I missed drawing a lot. And well, that, and also I wanted to add my own illustrations, kind of like you could say a manga or a comic, but or a comic author, or I mean author, not author. But in this case, I wanted to not just write stories, but also visualize them through images, such as like sketches or drawings of some kind. And at least when it comes to the art style that I'm trying to develop, I'd imagine it to be somewhere between like Western cartoons or animation, like you'd see both in like the old days and the new days. Like, maybe something along the lines of, like, say, Scruffy Turtles from like the guy who's currently working on the webcomic like Persona 5 Adult AU, right? And of course, like Vivian Madrana or Vivzy Pop, for those of you who know her from, say, Has Been Hotel and by extension Hell of a Boss. So of course, like, I've always admired their art styles and how very eccentric and yet at the same time very straight laced it is. Though I feel like I might lean more towards like Scruffy Turtles art, at least when it comes to mine, as I like it to be a blend of between anime slash manga art along with the traditional kind of Western kind of cartoon or animated style, or even comic style if possible. And I'd always like to imagine my art style being featured in some of my promotional or future promotional stories, or even like, say, if my works were to get adapted into animation, which personally I feel is the best form of medium or at least adaptation, because let's face it, animation is basically like going to be a dying art, or at least it feels like most of the time people prefer like a lot of live action or CG animation. Well, I have nothing against CG animation, but I prefer like traditional cell shaded animation. Well, I guess it's sort of digital too, but it's not like 3D computer graphics. But even so, I feel like if my works were to get adapted in some way, I definitely go for like a 2D traditional animation instead of simply like having it being live action or even like 3D animated. So overall, my art style would probably lean more towards like anime or manga, but with hints of like traditional or Western animation or even comics if possible. As I like both art styles, but I want to make my own unique art style if possible. A lot of you may notice that another form of adapting stories is video games, and as a result, I'm not really opposed to video game adaptations if possible, at least when it comes to my stories. Though there are certain kinds of genres that I would prefer for my video games, such as like visual novel or role playing games, especially if it's the Japanese or Eastern kind of style role playing game where you get character sprites or images that you get to talk to with chat boxes or text boxes in the middle or at least at the bottom of the screen, as I feel it's more immersive. And maybe it could be something like a social simulation or life simulation game, kind of like, I guess, Sims or Animal Crossing or even the Princess Maker games, right? And maybe for my other certain other stories, it could be action or maybe you could say a hack and slash adventure kind of game. Yeah, but at the same time, I'm not opposed to my games being more like role playing games with lots of dialogue and multiple endings, like those point and click adventure games that Telltale or even LucasArts would put in, as I feel like they would Although that would depend on what story would get adapted if possible, as I want it to be both immersive but also tell a story, hence why I prefer mostly the visual novel role playing game aspect of these kinds of, like you could say, potential adaptations of my stories. Another thing to add regarding my potential video game adaptation, at least when it comes to role playing games, I'd like it to be in the style of something like either Undertale or even something like Live Alive, as I was intrigued by the unique aspects of the of those kinds of role playing games. You could talk to people and interact with them, at least like vertically or along with like cutscenes, and maybe have the cutscenes be either animated, kind of like how they did in Persona, along with Danganronpa, but at the same time still maintain some of the usual aspects of either role playing games or visual novels, and maybe feature elements of, like, say, Final Fantasy, or even like Shin Megami Tensei, which was technically the original like game series that basically popularized Persona, but you get the point. Oh, right, and another kind of, I guess, video game that's connected to both either role playing or even visual novel is maybe dating simulators, because I wouldn't mind if, like, the player character got to choose which character I create specifically for a certain story. Like, say, it could be sort of alternate universe plotline where you get to date certain characters, though I want it to be a clean and less kind of, you could say, like promiscuous or adulterous kind of like dating simulator game, because I certainly don't want it to go on the kind of etchy side, if you know what I mean, because I want it to be wholesome but at the same time realistic. So, right, because like a lot of my stories are trying not to focus too much on like those fan service games. Well, like, I could feature fan service, not the sexual kind, but rather the, you could say, like the fan based kind, like the kind that reveals lore along with other kind of plot points that like intrigue people in a different way, you know? Another thematic element or aspect that will be featured in my stories is the idea of like prophecies, visions, omens, and anything related to the future or even fate and destiny, as there will be a recurring theme of whether fate or destiny can be changed. Although personally, well, I think fate can't be changed because it's presented as an absolute form of what will happen in the future, and that no kind of prophecy twist or self-fulfilling prophecy like could even change it, as like say you are fated to die no matter what, as I feel like those kinds of like absolute fates will happen. But when it comes to destiny, like destiny will or can be changed, though that only depends on certain scenarios. Like say you can prevent someone who's destined to die, or you can prevent like an evil like being from, like say, take over the world, for example. And overall, like those are the main themes that will happen, as especially since it could also tie into how some of my stories will feature characters going through redemption arcs, and how they are either fated to stay evil or they can choose to reject their evil path and embrace their potential destiny of being good, but overall, it depends on the actions of the characters and how it advances the plot, especially since some of my stories will feature the idea of like destiny more often, right? But it will add elements of fate, and especially when it comes to prophecies, as there will be cases where at least one character will kind of experience a vision or even a a prophecy of some kind, either through a dream or through some kind of omen that they can't explain, or it's just you could say a sort of gut feeling that they will feel, which makes them realize that something either really bad or something good will happen. Though that depends on the scenario. So like, but who and what kind of plot will feature, I can't tell because it's a bit of a spoiler. Oh yeah, and one last thing I want to talk about is my Encanto X Coco like OCs or original characters that I created, where I will focus on three of them that I created for this particular story. As, for example, like Alita Sanchez, who, like, she's a childhood friend of Bruno Madrigal, at least before he disappeared, and she works as a baker who, like, provides food for the villagers as well as her family, and is also a close friend to Julieta, given that they're both chefs or cooks in their own right. However, Alita is very passionate and straightforward when it comes to how she feels, to the point where she comes off as very blunt in the process. Though she means well, even if she can be rather critical. But then again, like, most of the characters in the story definitely need to hear, like, criticism, especially from her, as she's one of the few villagers who has enough common sense to realize that the villagers have taken advantage of the madrigals for far too long and have unfortunately, like, underestimated just how useful and, like, loved, like, Bruno and Mirabel are, as she is one of the few villagers who respects them, yeah, especially Bruno, given that she is all but stayed to have a crush on him, but unfortunately, because she was afraid that she might accidentally drive him away with her, like, crush, like, she was forced to keep it quiet, and it also didn't help that there were villagers who unfortunately did not approve of her relationship, or at least her friendship with Bruno, and kept trying to break them apart because of their misguided and, like, self-centered behavior towards Bruno, due to the fact that Bruno was unfortunately treated like the black sheep or an outcast of both the Madrigal family and the Encanto itself. And not to mention, because Alita is also seen as very beautiful compared to the other characters, she unfortunately gets harassed or at least courted by a bunch of suitors who won't leave her alone, especially for those who keep trying to propose to her, and she often has to drive them away with her rolling pin, or at least, like, tell them to just get out or leave before she does something even more violent. And I'd imagine her as resembling Miriam from the Prince of Egypt movie, because she's described as wearing a reddish dress along with having black wavy hair, though her hair is slightly shorter compared to Miriam's, though she does wear it in a bun at times, and she also has somewhat tanned or dark skin, as, like, per usual, like most of, like, the Latin American, like, people usually have, and she has brown eyes as well, which, well, I mean, it doesn't make her stand out, but she's said to be very beautiful. And for her voice actress, I'd imagine her being voiced by Salma Hayek, given that she has that sort of husky and yet passionate voice that would also make her attractive, and not just physically speaking. And for another OC that I created would be, like, Bonita, or Bonita Fuentes, as she's often called, as she herself is the childhood friend of not just Camilo Madrigal, but also Mirabel as well. Though technically she first met Camilo before she became friends with Mirabel, as they became friends with each other ever since they were 4 years old, or at least before Camilo got his gift. And as a result, they became, you could say, like, thick as thieves as a result, with Mirabel eventually joining in. Though Bonita is, like, a lot more no nonsense compared to Camilo, and she often has to sort of rein in his more, say, chaotic or mischievous antics. But at the same time, she is very patient, understanding, especially when she finds out about Camilo's, you could say, personal demons, or his issues that he had been hiding from everyone, including his own family. And as a result, she tries to help encourage him to be more honest about himself and to not constantly feel the need to hide behind masks, like, both metaphorically and physically. And she's also very compassionate and friendly towards Mirabel, and she does not stay friends with her because, like, she pities her, because she genuinely cares for her. And it helps that they both work at Alita's bakery, as though, well, they don't work together, as they often have different shifts, but they do visit each other from time to time and have no problem working together, especially if it involves taking care of the children of the villagers, along with Camilo. And, like, if you didn't guess by now, Camilo, he has a crush on Bonita. That's pretty obvious and will get commented on throughout some of my other stories, as I plan on doing several spin off stories focusing on some of the other characters, like especially Bruno and Mirabel, as they are basically the most prominent characters in the Encanto series, or at least in my Encanto X Coco series. And for, like, I guess her visual or physical description, I would describe Bonita as resembling Marie or Marie Corbel from Skullgirls. Oh, like she's far more heroic compared to her, though she does, or she probably would have a more soft-spoken tone, unless like she gets really mad. And like Marie, at least before she became the Skullgirl, she has, I'd imagine her as having brown hair, though hers is much darker, and you could say it's almost like black rather than brown, but nonetheless, it is still considered a dark or deeper shade of brown. And she'd probably have matching brown eyes to go with it, along with a somewhat dark skin tone that's kind of like between light and dark, or maybe olive, you could say. Although her hair style would probably be like worn in braids or pigtails, though they tend to curl inwards or like outwards depending on how it's stylized. And overall, her, like, I guess dress code, she'd probably wear like either like orange or brown or even yellow dresses, and she often is seen wearing an apron like Alita, and not only because she works at Alita's bakery, but it's because her she and her family are actually cheesemakers, as they have several cows to help provide dairy for the community, and they are known for creating panda bonos, which is a cheesy pastry that's popular in Latin American communities, especially in Colombia. So I figure why not add that element. As for her potential, like, headcanon voice, you could say, I'd imagine her as being voiced by Isabella Merced or Isabella Moner as she's, or Yolanda Moner as she's, I guess, fully called, where I feel like she has like that youthful tone that would allow her to convey like Bonita's like maturity or emotionally speaking, but at the same time, like it would give her a more, I guess, soft spoken aspect, like especially since Bonita, I'd imagine her as having a soft kind of speaking tone, unless, like I mentioned before, she gets really irritated. But even then, she'll probably go into like a sort of a cold sense of fury if she were to truly get angered. And at the same time, like her mentor, like a leader, she will not hesitate to beat up anyone who wrongs her, or even tries to harass her, as some unfortunate like bullies find out the hard way. Well, that is if Camilo doesn't get to them first, because he's not just in love with her, but he's also very protective of her. Though he can come across as a bit possessive, but nonetheless, he still cares for her. And finally, for my third OC, who will play a major role in my original, like, Encanto X Coco story, is Tulio, or Tulio the Ferryman, as he's often called, as I'd imagine him as being very, like, laid back and friendly, but if he sees someone who has clearly been wronged or mistreated, such as Bruno Madrigal, he will become very protective and will not hesitate to call out people in a very, well, not violent manner, but he is very blunt and gets straight to the point whenever he sees something bad happening, and will not hesitate to severely criticize or chastise people, as Peppa finds out the hard way. As like he when he finds out about how Peppa and the other Madrigals treated both Bruno and Mirabel to the point of driving them away. So of course, Julio is understandably furious on their behalf and tears into the entire Madrigal family, though he mainly targets Peppa because he sees her as the main root of Bruno's problems, and, well, along with Alma, but even then, it's mainly Peppa that he's angry at, though he later explains to Bruno that the reason why he was so defensive of him is because he was in a similar situation to Bruno, as it turns out. Well, it's a bit of a spoiler, but for those of you who didn't know, like, Tullio wasn't always a ferryman. He was actually born into a prestigious, or, like, you could say, noble or rich family, but unfortunately his parents were constantly like caring more about their wealth and their status along with their image rather than their family. And as a result, they often force their, or at least encourage their children to basically compete for their affection, which, as you can see, is a very toxic and unhealthy way of raising children. And the fact that Tullio was basically, you could say, the runt of litter, or at least the youngest of the family, didn't make things any easier. As he was not only neglected, but he was also severely abused and bullied by his older siblings to the point where he ended up running away until he met a sailor who took him in. But that was only after Tullio was forced to stay on the streets for, I guess, like a couple of months or weeks, you could say. And as a result, like Tullio ended up being adopted by, well, not a sailor, but he was a fisherman who taught him how to, like, not only fish but also work on boats and ships. And as a result, Tullio found himself traveling around the world and discovering many incredible and mysterious kind of places, along with the usual places such as like Colombia, along with Brazil and other parts of South America. Though he technically lives in Mexico, or at least in a fishing town called San Javi, which happens to be close to Santa Cecilia for you Coco fans. Like, hence why he becomes an important character, as he's the one who basically helps like the Madrigals find Mirabel by bringing them to Santa Cecilia, though they first have to stop at San Javier, but at the same time, they don't need to look for Mirabel for too long, as she happens to be at San Javier by the time they arrive. So, although like more details will be in the story, or at least for the link provided down in the description if you want to actually read it for yourselves. Well, that is if you also want to read or go to the my main profile page and see all the links I provided for my other kind of, well, not sites, but the other, like the official link to my archive of our own, along with my Facebook page or even my blog site. So yeah, go check it out if you want. Now back to like Tullio. I imagine him as resembling like Mogans from that movie Klaus. Yeah, whereas he'll also have elements of like Eduardo from the Extreme Ghostbusters. And I even imagine him as being voiced by like Eduardo's original voice actor, like namely Reno Romano, because, well, why not? I mean, like I feel like he'd probably have the tone that would convey like Tullio's laid back but also very like sarcastic yet honest tone, and he would not hesitate to like speak out against anyone who does something wrong, like especially towards people that he likes or respects, such as Bruno, which is why he basically becomes like the closest thing Bruno has to a brother. Like, while sure he has his brothers-in-laws, but even then, like he finds himself getting close to Tullio, but, well, not like romantically speaking, but rather as his main love interest is Alita, whereas Tullio is basically the brother he never got to have, and that's about it. Overall, those are the main three OCs that I kind of want to focus on, as I plan on featuring them in my spin off stories. And yes, they will serve as love interests to certain characters. Though Tulio's love interest is like a bit of a spoiler. Yeah, and that's all I'm gonna say.